Hello and welcome to this special episode of Eurofound Talks, which is to mark this year's International Women's Day, which takes place on the 8th of March. Today we're going to look in this particular context as women in the workplace, to a large degree, their work challenges, their life challenges and how they intersect. How we're going to look at that is we're going to actually delve into the research that we've carried out on a large-scale survey, interviewing about 70,000 people across 36 countries in the European Union, which took place in 2021. It's called the European Working Conditions Telephone Survey. The reason it's telephone is it took place during COVID, and so therefore we adapted our survey approach, and it was a telephone approach to a traditionally face-to-face survey. This survey, though, provides us a very, very detailed picture of the working lives of Europeans during this particularly difficult and demanding time. It looks at job quality, it looks at working time, but it also looks very specifically here at the intersection between work and what we call our private life. And that, of course, is the intersection, the Venn diagram, where most women are operating. And here we're going to try and explore a little bit the gender roles and the expectations, both in the private sphere and also in the workplace, and how this can impact on women in particular, but not only women, also men. And we're going to look at how they differ and look at how we potentially can involve ourselves in making progress into the future to resolve some of these conflicts which have emerged in the area of work-life balance. So today, to join me, I'm delighted to have two colleagues from Eurofound who have been working in this area for some time, Viginta Ivaškaitė-Tamošiūnė and Jorge Cabrita. Welcome.
Hello, ma'am.
Hi, good morning.
So today, maybe we can just take a big picture look, Jorge, and I'm going to go straight into it here and just look at the labour market. And I suppose what's interesting here is, can you talk to us a little bit about how women and men are engaged in the labour market? Is it the same? Is it very different? Are they segregated? Talk to me.
Thanks, Mary. That's a very, very good question. First of all, what we have to understand is that men and women have a very different role in the labor market. So overall, if you look at our employment structures, we can see that men and women are not doing the same things. They are not working in the same sectors. So if we start from a sectoral approach, what we can see is that most men are actually working in men-dominated sectors, whereas women, many of them, are also working in women-dominated sectors. So
what would they be, Jorge? What are those male-dominated sectors?
So if you think about sectors such as, for example, construction or information and communication technologies, those would be sectors which are predominantly occupied by men. Whereas on the other hand, if you think about sectors such as education or health or even cleaning, you would find those jobs mostly occupied by women. So this is at sectoral level. But if you go down at occupational level, the level of segregation is even higher. So at sectoral level, it's about roughly 40% of men and women in total working in gender-mixed sectors. But if you look at the occupation, so the type of jobs that people do, it's a much smaller share of men and women in gender-mixed occupations. It's only 25%, so it's a big difference. So the further down you go in more specific, let's say, perspective, the more segregated it is between men and women. So occupations we are thinking about, for example, cleaners or nurses, which are mostly occupied by women, whereas builders, in reference also to the sector of construction, are mostly occupied by men, or manufacturing jobs, for example, are mostly occupied by men as well.
Okay, so quite a lot of segregation still in terms of the gender aspect and fairly embedded in the labour market at this stage. Okay. And when you look then also, Viginta, at the work-life challenges for men and women, are they also different? I mean, we in Eurofound talk about paid and unpaid work, but maybe you can talk to me a little bit about what that means. How are women and men experiencing this?
Well, exactly. So our European Working Conditions Survey asked respondents not only about working hours in the main and other jobs and commuting, but it also asked about hours spent on taking care of, educating children, grandchildren, caring for elderly and relatives with disabilities, and also cooking and housework. So altogether, we refer to it as unpaid work. So other work, like as voluntary work, we acknowledge that it is very important, but in our survey, it's not covered. So we look at paid work, as I mentioned, so main job, other jobs, and then the other part that it's, as you referred at the beginning, it's a private sphere that you want to do, and we look how many hours women and men spend on unpaid work.
Okay. And the difference, Jorge, between men and women in terms of this paid and unpaid work?
That's quite an interesting one, because when we look at the figures, and this has been around for decades now, I would say, but it continues. And when we look at our data from last year, from 2021, we can actually see that men tend to spend a bit more time in paid work. So overall, on average, we're talking about 6 hours per week, whereas women spend much more time in unpaid work. And overall, on average, it's 13 hours. So when you take everything all together, paid and unpaid work, we are talking about a difference of 7 hours in which women spend on work in comparison with their...
So there, Jorge, if I'm correct, it's unpaid and paid together versus men paid and unpaid, and women consistently do 7 hours more.
Correct. If you think in yearly time, in a yearly period, in 1 year, you can think that if you put all that difference together, we are talking about 8 weeks of 40 hours of work that women are doing overall more than men. And that's a big difference. And it's mostly due to unpaid work. So it's a lot of unpaid work in an unfavorable situation for women. These differences are across the board. So if you look at the member state level as well, and this is quite interesting, they are the same everywhere. So you can find that difference. The difference is smaller though in some countries. So for example, in Luxembourg and France, we are talking about around 3 hours difference. So women put more than men, but you have differences. For example, it go all the way up to 17 hours of difference in Croatia, for example. And this is kind of symptomatic of the distribution of working time between men and women. So there's a big difference there across the board in most of the countries. In some, it's rather small, but in many countries it's very, very significant.
And also, I suppose, reflects back to what we talked about earlier about the segregation in the labour market and the kind of jobs that are being done by men and by women.
Correct as well. Well, it's part of related to that, but it's also related to, in our opinion, to the country culture, for example, and the way people see the roles of men and women in society. So the fact that in some countries women spend more time in unpaid work is symptomatic of that kind of approach and behavior from the society in general. Countries with a more egalitarian, let's say, approach, the differences tends to be smaller.
So this gender inequality is embedded in society and embedded in the labour market.
Correct.
Right. Not good news, Viginta. But if we look at this in terms of the more unpaid work that women we talk about, when we break this down into care responsibilities, is there an equal gap here?
Well, a short answer is no. And if we look at all those 3 unpaid activities that I mentioned before, we see that gender gaps are really different. And probably it's worth looking at it from the age dimension. So, for example, we're looking at caring for children and educating for children and grandchildren. If we look at the youngest age group, so I mean people from 16 to 24 years old, there's literally no gap in how often they take care of children. But then this gap, gender gap, increases with age, peaking at the age of 35 to 44. So where there are 18 hours more of unpaid work for women compared to men, and most of it is because of the childcare. I think 11 hours are the ones that are put by women to taking care of children. And then with age, the gender gap close. And for the older people, we mean older people, oldest group, 56 plus, we don't see any gender gaps anymore. So it closes. But then the story is a bit different if we're looking at the cooking and housework. What we see that men, 40% of men do cooking and housework daily, only 40% of men. And it stays stable across the age groups. If we look at women, the story is different because we see that the share of women doing housework and cooking increase with age, again peaking at the for the age group of 35 to 44, and the gap stays the quite large for the remaining groups, so it never closes.
And that age group, I suppose, is also involved in caring for older people, so parents, grandparents. So there's this sandwich generation.
This is exactly a sandwich generation because probably children are arriving around that time, career is progressing at that time, so financial needs are increasing, and of course, some elderly or older relatives require more care. So of course, this age group is the one which spends most time on unpaid work. But then if we're looking at caring for elderly or disabled members of family, the levels or the share of people who do take care of relatives is really small for both women and men. Right. And it actually increased slightly with age, but there is no gender gap as such. So this is one activity where we see that both...
Kind of equality.
Exactly, more or less gender equality. But taking all three activities, unpaid activities together, we see that for almost age groups, women are the ones who work longest hours. Except the very youngest group, so from 16 to 24. But later there's these hours increasing and peaking at the sandwich generation group.
And you can imagine that would cause some level of conflict within the household. You can imagine at a societal level it's building up tension, this sort of gender divide, which seems to be fairly entrenched. And we've talked always about work-life balance. It's kind of a benign concept in some ways. It's how do we balance our life with running and jogging and doing all that's good for us with our work. But in fact, here in the EWCTS, the most recent survey, we're talking here about work-life conflict. Talk to me, Jorge, about the difference here between these indicators.
That's a very good question, Mary. So work-life balance is a term which has been used very, let's say, popularly among business, in policy making, in research. So it's very popular in to some extent, and it reflects exactly what you said. It's the intention or the aim of men and women to balance, to even out their work with their private sphere. And what is interesting to note there is that this concept has been increasing in importance in EU policy, in the EU policy context. We have, for example, the European Pillar of Social Rights, which in its Article 99 refers specifically to work-life balance, and we also have in 2019 the European Directive on work-life balance for parents and carers. So in our working conditions survey, what we look at is basically at the relationship between working hours, so the time that people devote to paid work, in relation to their private life, in a way. So we ask people to what extent your working hours fit with your family and social commitments. But this only gives us one aspect, right? It's just about time, basically. But we know that there's much more than time. So that's why we talk about work-life conflict. And work-life conflict is all about the relationship and sometimes we talk about spillovers. It's the spillover of the effects of work into our private lives and vice versa. In the working conditions survey, we have 3 questions. So in 2021, we asked 3 questions. There's more, but in 2021, we capture 3. And 2 of them are in the direction of work over your private life. And the first one is about worry. So we asked people if they kept worrying about work during their free time, or non-working time. So that's one. The second one is if they felt tired after work in such a way that they were not able to do...
that they were prevented from carrying out their household.
Exactly, precisely. So that's another. So it's related to the physical, but also mental, let's say, psychological exhaustion. So it's that kind of thing that we are capturing there. But we also ask the reverse. We asked to what extent people found difficult to concentrate at work because of their family and social
family commitments. Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
So there's the reverse spillover effect as well. So we have these 2 different aspects, and both of them are quite interesting and important to acknowledge when we talk about work-life balance and work-life conflict.
And again, Viginta, not to labour the point too much, but I presume there are differences again between men and women when we talk about this satisfaction with their work-life balance?
Exactly. There are quite some differences. And probably a bit counterintuitively, we see that more women are satisfied with a work-life balance than men are. I mean, you would probably expect, different other way around, because it's mostly women who spend more time on paid and unpaid work altogether, no? But it seems that probably women tend to adjust the working time according to the needs of the family members. So they usually reduce their working hours when, for example, children are born. While men
so they're going part-time.
They go part-time, exactly,
okay.
or they drop out of the labor market completely. In our survey, of course, we're looking at women who stay in the labor market.
Sure.
For men, they tend to organize the work time around job needs, about work needs. And of course, there are then tensions. So they are not always happy that they put so many hours in paid work. And indeed, if we're looking at different age groups, so it's true that more women feeling good work-life balance than men for all age groups. Probably the different share of women and men who want to have a better work-life balance is again this sandwich generation people who are pressed with many caring needs, financial needs, and elderly people needs. So I would say it's almost always that women have this greater perception of better work-life balance. There's one exception, though. If we're looking at different household types, meaning if we are looking at people with children, without children, so we see that for men, gender balance is the worst when they have children and they live with partners. So of course they would like probably to spend more time with their children. For women, actually the most problematic situations for single mothers. They really want to have better work-life balance. And indeed, if I go back to paid and unpaid work, so I see that women, single mothers, spend 20 hours more than single fathers. Why it is? We assume that probably in case of divorce, it's still mostly the children stay with mothers. And even if they have a shared custody, which is increasing in Europe, we still see that it's mainly mothers who spend more time. So probably for them, it puts a lot of pressure on the work-life balance perception.
So here we were looking at a particular pain point, which is single mothers, when we look at this work-life balance issue in particular. But I assume not only, but we can come back to that at another stage. Jorge, when we look at this work-life balance, okay, for various reasons which actually probably dictate a little bit that better feeling of work-life balance for women, part-time working and leaving, well, in this case, we can't see leaving the labour market, but women tend to take steps to address that in advance. When it comes to the work-life conflict, what's the situation between men and women?
It's interesting to see that it's the reverse, actually. Oh. So women tend to fare worse than men on average in relation to work-life conflict. And this is why, this is mostly because here we are talking about certain characteristics of the working conditions of women. Because in relation to the data that we collected back in 2015, we did an assessment of that data and analysis, which showed us that certain working conditions are associated to this poorer work-life conflict. And we are talking about, for example, having a meaningful work, or having recognition for the work that you do, or having less flexibility in your working hours. So there's a number of things.
So not necessarily working time per se.
Exactly.
There's various elements and indicators. Okay.
Yeah, and that's why it's important to move away from just this working time approach, because there are many other aspects there in impacting on this idea of work-life conflict. So this idea of spillover between work and private life.
That's fascinating, Jorge, because that sort of dovetails in with this quality jobs aspect, which is, we know bad jobs make you sick, and so therefore it also, I suppose, represents less job or work satisfaction. And then you look into the society at large and how that spills over again into how people present in our societies, maybe with bad health, with psychological issues, with mental health concerns, etc.
Correct. Yeah. And actually, what we can see is that in our data from 2021, women tend to fare a bit worse in terms of job quality, which is shown by this indicator which we created. So women are more likely to be in jobs which are called strained jobs, where job demands
are under pressure.
They have more job demands than they have job resources that help them to carry out their work properly. And this then reflects, of course, one of the reflections is exactly this work-life conflict. So it's not surprising that women are kind of reporting this way. And in general, women also tend to report worse health than men do, although they live longer, but the level of morbidity is higher among women. And so this applies to the general population, but also to the working population, obviously.
So then, Jorge, that is another takeaway. I mean, is that if we address the job quality issues and if we look at quality jobs and improving working conditions, that actually we have these ripple effects which go well beyond just the immediate workplace. It's the work-life balance, work-life conflict, work satisfaction, and indeed life satisfaction.
Absolutely. That shows that, as it was mentioned here before in a previous podcast, that we looked at job quality, specifically, job quality is at the core of the transformation that we need to have these ripple effects, as you mentioned, in our societies in general, and especially to improve the condition of women in this situation, because as we can see, when we are talking about all these things, they tend to fare a bit worse than men do. So it's crucial
because again,
to
not to dwell too much on it, but we often talk about the gender pay gap and the gender employment gap, but in reality, pay is just one factor that we should be looking at. There's so many other elements, part of this job quality sort of composite index that we have. It's so important to look at all of them in a holistic way. It is. Pay is just part of the package, if you wish. So we have to look after the job demands and the resources that people have access to in their work. So the workplace is actually, because we spend so much time in our workplaces, don't we? So that's where we have to start the change, perhaps. Gender pay gap, the addressing of the gender pay gap is just part of the equation. So looking at this, Viginta, I mean, we are looking at prospects for how we can make things better, how we can change things, how we can see an evolution which kind of, I suppose, offsets the rollback in gender equality that we've experienced over recent times. What do you see as being kind of the primary factors that we need to address?
I'm not so sure if I can refer to it as primary factors, but certainly there are a few things we can address. And I want to go back to pay, for example. Financial incentives are one of the reasons why many women do more unpaid work at home. For example, when the kid arrives to a family, and given that women earn on average less, and we know that the gender pay gap is 30% in Europe, so then for family is financially better if woman actually reduces her working time or leaves the labor market, because still the main earner is a man, and then they calculate, They calculate and they look at those things. So I think Pay Transparency Directive is a good way to address this problem with gender pay gap. But then there's another aspect, what we tend to overlook, tax and benefit systems. And especially gender-biased taxation systems, joint taxation, or specific tax allowances or tax credits for a spouse with little or no earnings. It's proven that it incentivizes a second earner, and we know that second earners are usually women, to reduce their working hours or drop out the labor market completely. What does it mean? So in the longer term, in the short term, it increases women's financial dependency, first of all. In the longer term, of course, these inequalities accumulate. Women tend to contribute less to the social security schemes, meaning to the pension rights. And in old age, they tend to accumulate less wealth, less pensions. And what do we see? We see actually even higher or bigger pension gap in old age, and we see more women at risk of poverty in old age.
So we see a sustained gap through the entire life course. Yeah.
So it all accumulates. And then what happens in case of divorce? And we know that this is happening more and more often in Europe. So women are left in more precarious situation because they made some decisions to reduce their working time.
Sure.
And of course, working part-time, dropping out of labor markets, these things should be addressed also, as I mentioned, through ensuring that they can earn more, and then removing gender bias in taxation so that it does not incentivize them to stay out the labor market.
So when I hear you, the sort of often quite simplistic approach that introduce more and better childcare and all will be well, it's much greater than that and demands a kind of much more comprehensive approach than...
Yeah, exactly. I mean, there are different sides of it. Of course, having accessible and good childcare, it's a key for both women and men to participate. But there are so many smaller elements that we can start addressing.
But also that need to be in place for this actually
Exactly.
to function effectively. So, Jorge, do you have any good news for us about the prospects for improving all of this into the next generation?
Well, I think that, first of all, at European level, at least, there's a number of initiatives there, and we mentioned already 3 of them here. So the directives on work-life balance and pay transparency, the European Pillar of Social Rights. Those are things which indicate that there's a concern, right? There's an interest in changing things to make things that change happen.
All part of that gender equality strategy.
Exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. But we have to also address other things, such as, for example, something that we would like to mention here today, which is the gender stereotypes. So the fact that we still have men and women entering the labor market, as we mentioned at the beginning, to different sectors, to different occupations. We have to break that kind of cycle, and we have to start from the very beginning, I would say, through education, for example, to raise people's awareness that jobs have no gender. So men and women can do any kind of job with the technology available. There's no gendered approach to jobs. So that's one starting point. And then the other one I would like to underline as well is the cost of opportunity of this difference in the unpaid working time. When women are spending these hours on average more than men are...
8 weeks per year, you said, in unpaid work.
Yes, if we take the average, that would be the roughly... So when they are doing that unpaid work, they are not doing other things. And those other things could be their participation in, let's say, political activism or taking up volunteering work that could bring, and increase their skills and competences that in turn would give them more chances to have, a better career progress.
And of benefit to society and the economy as a whole.
Of course. Yeah. So there's a number of things there that we can still can address. But the prospects are good. I mean, recently, for example, we are talking about the 4-day week. Right, so this rearranging of our working lives in such a way that instead of spending 5 days a week at work, you reduce working time to 4 days, and people have more time for their private sphere, for the other things that they do in life, including entertainment and sports and volunteering, and also spending time with their family members, etc. So there's an interest to challenge these things, right? The way things are at the moment.
So if I was to, at the end of all of these Eurofound Talks series, we ask our experts to talk to me in 3, and essentially to pretend that I am the policy maker and I can fix everything over the coming year. So were that to be the case, what would be your top? We've covered a lot of issues here, and you've put a lot of pinpointing, a lot of possibilities for how we could change and improve things. But if you only had 3, who wants to go first?
Yeah, I probably would start. First, bring men into care work, in childcare. I think Work-Life Directive is a good way forward. So it introduces 2 weeks of parental leave, paternity leave for fathers around their childbirth, and then 2 months of non-transferable parental leave. I think these are very good first steps, which has a potential to address gender norms, stereotypes, thinking who should be the main carer in a family. So if we could extend and actually have longer non-transferable periods for fathers, so maybe little by little on our minds the norms would shift and men would take more responsibility of their children.
Good. Sure.
Another aspect would be, I would say, to bring then the discussion to the workplace level, which you mentioned here several times today. And the idea would be to raise the awareness of managers when dealing with their staff in order to give the example, first of all. So when it comes to the use of family leaves, for example, they would set the example to their staff, and then to have nowadays we talk about the compassionate management, right? To be more compassionate to their staff and understanding that people are more than their jobs and that they can listen and try to adjust work and the way work is organized to people's needs in a better way. So that costs nothing. It's just a matter of attitude and behavior. And I don't know to what extent policymakers can change this, but they can certainly start the ball rolling in that direction.
It's quite a cultural thing as well, though, isn't it? Because it's embedded so much, particularly, I would argue, with women, that compassion has to be felt for women managers themselves to take that step, that they have the courage to be that template for others. And that's not always easy when you are contextualizing it within a gender-biased society.
Correct.
Yes.
And then the second, probably what I mentioned, I mean, we need to remove gender bias in taxation. Although majority of the member states don't have financial incentives or so-called marriage bonuses in the tax systems, but then there are countries where they still exist. And then, as I mentioned, it incentivizes the second earner to stay out of the labor market, and it has really financial consequences. So even Parliament in 2019, it called for removing joint taxation and moving to individual taxation so that we don't perpetuate gender stereotypes and we don't contribute to this unequal paid and unpaid work sharing. So personal income taxation should be designed in such a way that it actually encourages more equal sharing of paid and unpaid work, more equal sharing of income, pension rights, so women and men can thrive in a gender equal economy.
Okay, thank you all. Extremely interesting discussion today. We could have gone on for at least another hour, if not more. Thank you very much. We've covered such a wide range of issues. At the end, we were wrapping up with taxation. We were wrapping up with paternity leave. And also looking at the role of managers in terms of acting as constructive, I suppose, mentors in the workplace. But I would like to also pinpoint the issues that came up at the very start, the gender segregation, occupational, sectoral, and also in terms of managerial, how many men are managers versus how many women. So it's so embedded. And then to come back to your issues there of single mothers and how we need to differentiate even within women's groups themselves, that it's not all one size fits all just in terms of gender. So thank you so much, Viginta. Thank you so much, Jorge. This is another edition of our Eurofound Talks. And this one builds on the most recent one we had with Barbara, which looked at job quality. And we would like you to visit our website where you can see a data story, particularly on adverse social behaviour, which affects women more than men in the workplace, which was written and is online and available to you. But of course, the big report on working conditions in the time of COVID-19, implications for the future, looks at every aspect of working conditions and not just the gender dimension. And I would encourage you to read that and download it from our website. Also, of course, to continue to follow us on social media channels on LinkedIn, Facebook and Twitter, and access us at any stage for any information you should need on this or any other issue. Until next time, when Eurofound talks to you.